This is Below the Line. And we are live with episode number 60-something, not exactly sure. I also probably need to fix how I number these episodes, but welcome back, everybody. Today's episode is it's going to be one of our very first for YouTube. So it'll be on everywhere else, but YouTube is paying us $100 million to add the podcast to YouTube. So we decided to bend our ear and listen to them. So we're adding our podcast to YouTube, actually for free, and they didn't even reach out. But the episodes are now going to be available on YouTube with video. And so if you're watching this on YouTube, welcome. Smash the hell out of that subscribe button. We're just getting started on this platform, but we're going to start using YouTube links more and more throughout all of our socials and things like that. So look for that and check it out on YouTube. See if the video adds a little bit of an extra element to the experience. I'm about a year and a half into starting this podcast, and I was reflecting on just the different topics that we've chatted about. The whole podcast is about creator psychology and managing that inner game. You feel me? Managing all of the stuff that goes in between the ears and goes on in between the ears when creating, which is, well, that is below the line. That is the 90% of the iceberg that no one sees. That is just constantly, for me at least, humming. And it's our minds are like sonar systems. Just kind of, you've seen those submarine sonar systems that go beep, beep, and they're just going around, looking for risks, looking for potential issues. And so much of the below the line story of creation is, and so much of managing that inner side of the creator game, for the founder, the painter, the musician, so much of it is just seeing what could go wrong, what is going wrong, how do we fix what's going wrong, what could go wrong next. Okay, nothing's going wrong yet, but every day, every week, something can just go wrong. And that sonar is just always going. And usually there's like 4 different things going wrong, 3 different things going wrong. And it's like a magnet for your attention. And the reason that we have these sonar systems is, for me, it's just, there's so much ingrained fear of failure. And I realized a year and a half into doing this podcast, I have never done an episode on failure. So I wanted to do an episode just on that very thing that sits right below the surface that powers so much of the magnetic pull of what I'm focusing on to try to avoid this failure. And this episode is dedicated to all of that activity beneath the surface. And in many ways, it is dedicated to the relationship that we create with failure, and in how sometimes it's quite unhealthy, and sometimes it is, I think with experience, it can become healthier and healthier. I also want to say that we are going to kick off a hotline where listeners can call in and leave a voicemail, and we'll check those voicemails for questions. You can ask questions just like a radio show. Just ask me questions on anything, entrepreneurship related, startup related, creator related, whatever you want. Ask any questions. It's 424-272-6640. That's 424-272-6640. And we'll put it in the show notes for you to be able to see that number and call it from here on out. You can call and literally ask any questions you're curious about. and I want to get to them. The other thing that I'm going to start doing is incorporating a little. I have a obsession and love with music, so I'm going to start incorporating a little music into episodes. And yeah, let's get into it with this song. It's called Spaces. Oh yeah. Kick drum. That is one badass kick drum. Ooh. All right, that is a good way to start off any episode, but especially this one. That song is, that took me about 15 years to create. And that is a song by Working Man, which is just the pseudonym that I've got on SoundCloud and Spotify. And that song, like I said, took me 15 years to create. Over the last 15 years, and I'll tell you why it's relevant to failure in a second, but I have created 3 different alter ego pseudonymous artist names over the last 15 years. Tried 3 different times to create music that I would put out into the world just for fun. Never, I don't think my mind ever went to that's what I want to do as a career, but loved creating music from when I picked up piano when I was about 16. But that song has so many stutter starts to just even in the last 2 months to create it. So many walls that I would hit, so many notes that would be played wrong. It's truly incalculable to think about how many things I got wrong to be able to have a song that I can press play and actually enjoy listening to. The whole thing is 15 years and it would take me an hour to give the whole backstory of how many stutter starts it's taken to get to that song. But any song, when you're writing it and creating it, like any creation, this is why I encourage every listener, whether it's gardening or cooking or music or pottery, whatever it is, even if you're not a founder of a company, I highly, highly encourage you to create something, some side hustle of creation, because it fosters a very healthy relationship with failure. It fosters, I don't even think that, especially if you consider it as a side hustle, maybe in the early days of cooking and gardening and music, you do think of it as failure, but you become numb to it because you just realize that there's different forms of failure. There's controlled failure of, I royally screwed up the pie, the succulent you're trying to tend to, the song that you're trying to write. And you do feel that in the beginning, but you start to become numb to it because it's just part of the process. And that's a really healthy perspective, that it's part of the process, that ultimately failure is not the opposite of success. It's a prerequisite. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, the entire thing is built around creator psychology, business psychology. I remember when I was playing basketball, organized basketball in high school, our dad introduced us to this concept and this field of study called sports psychology. And I guess in the 90s or early 2000s, it was about 30 years old of this whole field of trying to understand the psychology behind an athletic pursuit, sports psychology. And it all started with a great a great book called The Inner Game of Tennis. In this book, The Inner Game of Tennis, whether you're playing tennis or basketball or football or ping pong, it's an invaluable read on managing the inner game, all of the things that go on in your mind, whether it is waking up the day before or the day of a tennis match or a basketball game, going into practice, the mindset around what I will call controlled failure. That's all practice is. If you're going in to shoot 3-pointers, the point isn't to make every single one. If anything, the point is to get rid of all of the misses that you can, so that when you approach the game, the actual game itself, you are going to be able to perform the best you can. That controlled failure. Take as many shots as you can. Miss 70% of them. And if you miss 65% of them, you shoot 35%. That's you're world class at shooting 3-pointers in high school. And it's so much of the podcast is oriented around this nascent, kind of non-existent field of business psychology, where I'm trying to piece together through conversation, through the research out there, through my own experience, trying to piece together optimal approach psychologically to creation and managing that inner game. And I realized, like I said at the top of the intro, so much of the management is management around your relationship with failure. So one of the things that brings this to mind, and by the way, I feel like I look back at my 20s and it was just riddled with failure in my 20s. And I can comfortably say that there's no pity party for it. I just look back objectively. It's like, fuck, I was striking out quite a bit. And at 34, I'm like I said, there's a healthy perspective and comfort with being able to be honest with myself around that. I had a failed fly fishing company, a failed platform that I built for nonprofit fundraising, built out Tilt, a social payments application. Within 2 years, got it to about 2.5 years in, got it to a $400 million valuation, only to about 2 years later sell it for basically a fire sale to Airbnb. And all of the emotion and all of just what goes into that type of climb and fall, I experienced in my 20s. And I love that I experienced that. At the time, I was just a total mess. I'd say I handled it maybe better than most. I'm really fortunate that our dad taught us to meditate when we were quite young, about 8 years old. He was teaching me mindfulness. He was teaching me the concepts of detachment. I've always had for some reason, since I was even 5 and 6, always had some strong faith, and maybe not some specific, I don't mean faith in some specific form, but just this vague faith that it will all work out. And I'm thankful for that. But holy shit, did it not work out there even this year. I was joking. We sold as a fire sale to Airbnb, but Airbnb stock, and my 2 years that I spent there, it's like, okay, well, at least I'll get something out of it. And then the beginning of this year, the most black swan of black swan events in any industry happened, of a global pandemic that basically shut down travel globally the year that Airbnb was going to go public. And I was like, this is so interesting and typical that everything that I build gets so close and then just fizzles in my hands. So I have an intimate relationship with failure. All of that is to say I have a very familiar relationship with failure. And about a week ago, what really brought all of that as the background to the foreground was I don't know why, but I was looking through Instagram, and I looked at my old company Tilt. I looked at the I looked at the Instagram account that we created for, I think for recruiting purposes. It was called Tilt HQ. And I think we had deleted the main account because it's Airbnb owns it now, and we had this side account for recruiting, just what life was like at HQ, headquarters of Tilt. And I was looking through it, and all of these photos, it's like an artifact of how we presented ourselves. And yes, there were photos of the amazing people I got to work with, but it was also just an angle and lens in which we wanted the outside world to see what we were up to. And there was so much embarrassment looking at it and scrolling through and seeing photo after photo of this polished, positioned, motivated lens in which I wanted and I didn't manage the account, but certainly it was an extension of my own approach. And I mean, many companies, you recruit with canonical advice is, recruit with your best foot forward. I don't know if I believe that anymore, but but it was certainly true that we did that. And it's just this pit in my stomach of all of these amazing people and smiles and, dinners and off-site photos of team trip to Tahoe. And it was just, if I were to try to articulate this feeling, this pit in my stomach, it was just pure embarrassment. And it just kind of crushed me for a few hours. And it was two things were happening, two perspectives were. I was able to look at it and say, "Oh, that is so embarrassing," and just disconnected from what was really going on in a company that would ultimately not work out, would fail, versus the perception that we wanted the world to see. And it was like there in this perception or lens that we wanted the world to see the company, there was no room in the equation for failure. Everything was just bulletproof and beautiful and happy all the time. And I think that was the second perspective that really gnawed at me, that really made me feel shame, was that this entire podcast is dedicated to the opposition of that, the real below the line version of the story that makes room for not just failure, but much more importantly, makes room for reality, the real version of these stories. And that was a story where it was all the above the line version. All of the just self-deception and outward deception of everything is just so amazing in these four walls. And it really made me think about, not that I was okay with the fact that it failed. I was not okay with the fact that there was no room in the equation in this outward appearance for failure, for missteps, for mistakes. And that is 34-year-old me versus 26-year-old me, 27-year-old me, 29-year-old me. And it's maybe, and I don't think it's because I'm so wise, it's just I saw how that worked out. And that does not work out very well. There was such a fear of failure within my own mind, within my own psychology, that I wanted everything to be presented outwardly as if it was working, as if it was succeeding. And I thought the opposite of success is failure. So we can't have the outward perception be anything but success. Can't have failure to it. That was my own mind. That was my own psyche, was just control out, box it out, just get rid of it from the equation. And I had a very unhealthy relationship with failure. I thought of failure as this monolithic thing that if you even just dip your toe in it, it's going to stain the whole thing. And it's going to be this blemish you can't get rid of. And I've now come to learn and think pretty often about the fact that there's controlled failure and terminal failure. And there's two different kinds. And the way to avoid terminal failure, the symbolic on your deathbed, I failed in X, Y, or Z, or this, I have all of these regrets in life, that type of terminal failure. That type of terminal failure is very different than the controlled failure. Controlled failure is the golfer in the golf range that is shanking shots left and right to get better, is failing in that immediate sense, in that very controlled sense, and being honest about those failures of where his or her game needs to develop to get better. And it is the best athletes, and what I've now since learned, the best founders and the best leaders create massive amounts of room for failure to discuss it. One of the things that I loved about working at Airbnb is Brian Chesky would talk about things not going wrong, and it wouldn't be in some sermon sense. It would just be, wow, 54% of employees are dissatisfied with X. We need to address that. I'm not doing a very good job of addressing that. And it was immediate. There was no reframing. There was no just pushing it aside, or we're going to deal with that down the road. Bad news would come and sunlight would be placed right on it. And good news would come and sunlight would be placed right on it. But the equation, it was like the golfer being honest with themselves about shanking the ball to the left every drive. And it's only through that lens of honesty that you can diagnose what's failing to be able to fix it, to be able to improve it. And it is a very healthy relationship, knowing that success is only possible by being really honest with where there is these controlled failures along the way. Ooh, there are some good points being made right there. But real quick, I want to tell you about a company called Vanta. Does your startup need a SOC 2 report to close big deals? Or do you already have a SOC 2, Sakatumi report, as some in the biz say, and want to make it easier to maintain year after year? Vanta has built software that makes it easier to both get and renew your SOC 2. With Vanta, you avoid anxious auditor interviews, and you don't have to capture hundreds of screenshots, proving that you are a SOC 2 compliant company to your auditor. Companies like Lattice, Clubhouse, and Bolt, that is a portfolio company of mine, and I also reached out to them before putting them on the ad list, and Bolt specifically said they rock, period, awesome, period, was the CEO's response. And hundreds of others have successfully gotten their SOC 2 reports with Vanta. Below the line listeners can redeem $1,000 off a Vanta subscription by visiting vanta.com/BTL. That's vanta.com/BTL. This episode is also brought to you by Tiny Capital. Selling your business is a miserable task. Months of negotiation, legal fees, and then you get to watch the new owners trash the business you built. Enter Tiny. Tiny Capital was built to become the buyer we wish we could have sold to with the company that we sold to Airbnb. It's fair, fast, and founder friendly. I love Airbnb. I'm so glad that happened the way that it did, but oh my God, was it painful. The months leading up to it, the months during a negotiation, and then the months afterwards. It was such a miserable experience that Tiny has built the dream experience for selling your company. If you're looking for a new home for your internet business, they will respond in a day or two, make an offer in 7 days, and close a straightforward deal in about 30 days. The whole thing can be done in 30 days. And if you go to tinycapital.com, you can see success story after success story. And I know some of these founders that have loved their experience of working with them, of the businesses thriving on the other side of the acquisition rather than getting trashed. It is the dream scenario for selling your internet business. Go to tinycapital.com to get in touch. I heard a psychologist once say that the way to build an antidote to a feeling, a negative feeling, is to expose yourself to it in tiny amounts over and over and over again. It's called exposure therapy. And the way that he phrased it was, eat a bit of poison every day. And if you eat a bit of poison every day, you ultimately become immune to that poison. And, metaphorically speaking. And expose yourself to a little bit of this thing that you hate more and more every day. And the more that you expose yourself to it, the more immune you become to it in the long term. And in many ways, that is a healthy approach to failure, is exposing yourself, being honest with yourself, me being honest with myself, whether it was the stutter start of this podcast, every song that I create. And it's great to create songs because it's there are these very small, very finite pieces of creation. Every song that I create gets 20% in, and the framework is like, oh, this could be really cool. Then for the next 70% of the process, I'm like, this sounds fucking awful. This is not coming together. So from 20% of the journey to 90%, and it gets worse. It's, 20% gets worse and worse. And then it starts around 80%. I'm like, I'm going to just bail on this song. This is not going anywhere every single time. And then it starts to come up, still 90% in. I'm like, this is terrible. And then the last 10%, every single time, I don't know what it is, but it comes together. And I love that that side passion of creating music has instilled this creative arc that I just know the pattern and I recognize it. And I know that I'm almost at home when I feel I've put 12 hours into this song and this is not working out. I'm like at home in that because I know in hour 13 it's going to start to come together. My wife was the one she's an artist. She's probably painted 1,000 paintings, and she's the one that actually told me that narrative arc in the first place. And once she said it, once it was just out there as an observation, I started to map my own kind of finite creative process in that. With companies, it's a lot harder. With your own company, with your own career, it's a lot harder because just it feels much more indefinite than a painting you're spending 5 days on or a song you're spending 2 or 3 weeks on. But that narrative, that arc exists, absolutely exists. And the more that you expose yourself to that arc, the more paintings the more you're okay with feeling that way. You get 300 paintings in, 500 paintings in, the more you become friends with that arc, that creative arc. And in other words, the more you are exposing yourself to that uncertainty of how it's going to come together, the more familiar it becomes and the more you feel at home in that trough of sorrows of thinking that it's never going to come together. And the more that you're comfortable with it, the more you're familiar with it. In other words, the more that you are eating that poison of uncertainty, the less it matters. I don't even think about that trough anymore. Maybe every once in a while, just for the sake of the fact that I have a podcast around this topic. But for the most part, I'm just like, okay, yeah, this is, I almost know this is about the point in time it's going to turn around and get better. And that idea of eating the poison every day, I think one of the most profound works of fiction, nonfiction, mythology, whatever you want to call it, that humans have ever come up with is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita it's a Indian mythology. It's an 800-line poem, 800-verse poem. You can read it in like 30 minutes. But it is so, as my nephew would say, that is so tight. He's actually 8 years old. He probably wouldn't say it's so tight, but as younger people might say, this thing is so good. So, and it's like anything ancient. It's, unless it's presented in the right way, you just toss it aside. It's like the Bhagavad Gita is what the dudes in the orange robes have been handing out at airports for 50 years. But there's a reason it's lasted 2,500 years. And anything that lasts that long is worth taking a look at. It is, it's a poem, and the character arc is so brilliant, and it's basically a warrior prince having a conversation with his charioteer right smack dab in the middle of a battle that's about to happen. They're literally sitting, just in terms of where the story is set. It's dialogue of a warrior and his charioteer right in the middle of a battle. The epic battle. The middle of the most epic of epic battles of a civil war that has been raging for hundreds of years. And this is the absolute, almost like geometric center of all of the conflict that has been happening for centuries. And they're having a conversation. And chapter 18 has, I think, within this extremely profound metaphorical, it's basically the conversation we have within our head and heart as we find ourselves in the midst of something of consequence. And it is that internal dialogue that we have manifested in a poem between a charioteer and a warrior. And this is starting with oral tradition, probably refined over hundreds of years before we got to this version. And it is just like I said, out of all of the literary works of any saint, sage, or author, this thing is it. And even if you just read it as a metaphorical fiction, which I read it as, it is, it's a brilliant, it's like one of the first works of psychology. And within it, chapter 18 has, I think perhaps maybe the most profound concept, that most profound observation that humans have ever come up with. And again, this is at least 2,500 years old, maybe older. And the observation in chapter 18 is, what is bitter in the beginning is sweet in the end. And what is sweet in the beginning is bitter in the end. And some translations have it as, what is poison in the beginning is sweet in the end. So much of my 20s, so much of my life, so much of my freaking Tuesday is, how do I have these sweet experiences, these pleasurable experiences? How do I avoid discomfort? How do I avoid poison? But in avoiding it and being, for me, because I don't want to preach at anyone, but in my experience, my first decade of my career was avoiding failure at all costs. In other words, I was so attached to success being the outward appearance in every possible way, that everything I was doing was just, this is pleasurable, this is sweet, this is comfortable, and choosing comfort over reality, over growth, over bitterness, over failure in the small and big ways. And then what is so just mind-blowingly ironic is the whole decade was dominated by failure. Nothing succeeded in a sustainable way. Everything humans create, well, except for something like the Gita or a handful of other ancient works, everything has an arc that goes up and down and fails. And that's fine. I love how Jeff Bezos even talks about how Amazon will fail one day. He's just open about it. Talk about being open with failure. The founder of $1 trillion company is talking about one day openly, publicly, just saying, yeah, we will fail one day. And that, being able to say that comes from an intimate familiarity with, in his own mind, knowing that it is possible and being able to say it internally, honestly, and probably 1,000 times before he said it externally, outwardly. I couldn't do that in my 20s. I tried to shield out the poison, the bitterness, the failure, that then it just ended up, what we are attached to, we lose. I was so attached to success and the signs of success that, and gripped on it, clung to it, and all of the signs of it, that it warped my whole world to where any bit of failure that would enter the equation, I would just push it out. And it took me far. It took me really far. It took the valuation of the company to a pretty far, pretty interesting territory. It took the company to pretty interesting territory. We got to 100 employees. We scaled to 9 different countries. But here's the thing. It was not on a foundation of reality. And that might be a dramatic way of putting it. We worked our asses off. It's not like we edited out every bit of potential failure, but it was like I had lenses on, and it would edit out 20% of the warning signs, 20% of the failure. And maybe that allows you to go pretty fast down the highway, but if you're editing out 20% of the boulders on the road, it is only a matter of time before reality catches up with you. And so it wasn't like it was just a walking catastrophe each day and we were oblivious to it. That's not how self-deception works. It's more like editing out 20% of the boulders and feeling like you're cruising down the road, and then one day you slam headfirst into a boulder and it catches you completely off guard because the reality doesn't match up to your perception, and you start to question everything about your perception because it's so far off from reality. But before that acute experience, you're seeing 80%. You're seeing some of the boulders, you're missing them. You are pushing yourself. You're looking at the odometer and you're making good time and you're cruising through one hell of a journey. But the thing is, there's always going to be boulders on the road. If you're trying to make any journey from A to B, there are going to be obstacles along the way. And if there's anything that is that I think distills the point of this podcast, is to have conversations with people that expose the fact that every creative journey, every founder story has a shit ton of obstacles all along the way. And this is very different than the podcast conversations, the blog posts, the magazine articles that make it look like it's this very clean and clear, up and to the right. I started this in my dorm room and we sold it for $1 billion type of stories that just are not real, that are a cheap selection of facts for not even just to deceive the audience. It's just a magazine article, 1,000 words. You can't put everything in it. That's a beautiful thing about podcasts, is that you can have the long form answers to these really important questions. You don't have to just focus on the good. I get it. I get why a tech blog post on or an announcement on TechCrunch for a new product launch, you're only going to focus on how great the product is, the features. You're not going to talk about all of the obstacles. But in these types of conversations, you can talk about those parts of the story to normalize it, to make it seem like that is real. And listeners know I've talked about this on the podcast before, it's not just, hey, these are some details that fill out a story and make it more real. I think it's much more important than that. I think it is absolutely tragic that these aspects of the stories get omitted, because so many creative, innovative minds, so much innovation gets lost when a founder is 7 months in to some pursuit and it is not going well. Things are failing and they feel like this isn't like any other story I've heard. They get 15 months in and they feel like this is nothing like the Instagram story, the Facebook story, the Uber story. Luckily, people now know the shadow side of the Uber story. But it is a damn near tragedy that we think these stories are these clean up and to the right pursuits. That, I was part of the problem. We positioned ourselves to where was this up and to the right? Look at this. It's just working. And everything's going well. And we would say these pithy things like, we've had our share of challenges, but then boom, we'd spend 4 words on that and then go into how we were succeeding. Because in my mind, it mapped exactly to my psychology. I wouldn't sound ridiculous about how everything was working out, but I was scared, terrified. I was so scared of looking directly at all of the different failures, all of the different negative sides of things, because I felt like if I gave them too much attention, we would lose employees, we would lose momentum, I'd lose sleep, I would lose confidence in myself. But the truth is that failure, just to repeat it, is not the opposite of success. It is the prerequisite. And now it's like so obvious, plain as this microphone in front of my face, that is the case. The golfer knows this. The basketball player in me knows this. The artist knows this. Anyone that, as William Blake puts it, the fool that persists in his folly becomes wise. Anyone that persists in their path learns this. I just wish it was more of the cliches that we talked about, more of the narrative that we talked about, that is all part of the path to success. And the real opposite of success is this hardcore attachment to this concept of success. And is this clinging that attaches to it, grips to it, holds on so emotionally, terrifyingly, that you don't create space for failure in the lens in which you view your work. If you're not failing, and not just being open with yourself or being honest with yourself, but actually embracing it, leaning into the failure, that bitter pill each day, that little bit of poison, that not just honesty, but in a strange way craving it, then you might be fine today, tomorrow, for a few months, maybe even a few years, but you're gearing up for one hell of a comeuppance. That's the word, right? Comeuppance, yeah. That's the most embarrassing part of looking at that Instagram account, is that the guy in those photos celebrating this win or that win, has no idea the comeuppance that is right around the corner. They say that most companies fail because they prematurely scale. They scale, they expand before they're ready, and there isn't a foundation to sustain it. We scaled to 9 different countries. We had 100 employees. We took on massive amounts of funding and scaled to millions of users, but we didn't have this healthy foundation below it. And it looked good on a graph going up and to the right on some metrics. Some were awful. And I didn't make space for that. It like out of this insecurity that this might fail, I didn't want to let any light in the room that we had failures along the way. And it was like I wanted the signs of success out of that insecurity, these points of validation, craved those signs of success versus the real success itself. And it's like I wanted the fruits without the roots. I wanted those symbols without really growing this network of roots to sustain what we would scale the company to. I don't want this to be preachy. This is just my experience. But why do companies prematurely scale? If that's the reason that they say most companies fail, most startups fail because they prematurely scale, why do they do that? For me, in my own psychology, it was that craving of those signs. It was as if I wanted a garden bed of freshly cut flowers planted in a row. And planting freshly cut flowers, it looks good for a little bit, but that's a very temporary, good-looking photo. And if I had actually taken in that bitter pill each day and each week and each month, I wouldn't have scaled it out to where there are these beautifully freshly cut flowers as a sign that there was a healthy garden there. It would have been waiting for these roots to grow deep. And in those roots are what would have allowed for anything to come and sway whatever we were building, and it didn't matter because we had those deep roots. The most embarrassing part of this, of scrolling through that Instagram, is that it wasn't real. It wasn't honest. And even more painful is that was my choice. I'm going to link to this Instagram link in the show notes for anyone that's interested in checking out. It's probably not going to have the emotional depth for you that it has for me, but if anyone's curious and interested, you can check it out in the show notes. This episode, like all of mine these days, is brought to you by my own company, magicmind.co, or my newest company. It is a magical concoction of 12 active ingredients that get you into creative, productive flow every morning. It extends your morning coffee, morning tea for 6 to 7 hours. And if athletes have Gatorade, creators now have Creatorade. And I talk about the drink all the time. It just rocks. It is so good at getting you into productive, creative flow. Every day I take it, I'm 40, 50% more productive, and I take it every day because of that. It's designed to be taken every day alongside your current morning ritual. You don't have to throw out your coffee or anything like that. Go to magicmind.co, enter promo code BTL to get a discount for all listeners, below the line listeners, BTL, magicmind.co. Below the line version is we can't afford the .com. So magicmind.co and enter promo code BTL. Like I said at the top of the podcast, smash the hell out of, I'm still learning the YouTube lexicon, but I think it goes, smash the hell out of the subscribe button to subscribe to the podcast and check it out on YouTube if you haven't yet. Also, hit us up on the hotline. The hotline number, again, is 510-214-3717. It's also in the show notes. Check it out. And as my favorite podcaster says, let's go out the same way we came in, with a little bit of music. So that's what we're going to do here.